So Zahav restaurant is a modern Israeli restaurant. I mean, I use air quotes usually because our cooking methods here are quite primitive. You know, we cook meat like on sticks over charcoal. We cook bread to order in a wood burning oven. The way that we've sort of captured Israeli food and been able to look at it or have the vantage point from looking at it from a third person, and the idea that you could put all of the flavors together and then transport it and sort of make it global is what has made it modern. I was born in Israel, but we moved to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania when I was like super young, like 3. My dad is Israel. He's born in Bulgaria, but spent most of his life in Israel. My mom was American. I moved to Israel and met my dad. And so when we moved back to the States, it was that of there wasn't a lot of like Hebrew. That my parents spoke Hebrew when they didn't want myself or my brother to understand what they were saying. We always had like tahina at the table with like bread and salad, and there were a couple little hints of the fact that we weren't quite like everybody else. And then when I was 15, we moved back to Israel, and I spent a year there in a boarding school with other Americans, and then came back to Pittsburgh by myself, and I had that sort of the bug where I didn't feel quite at home really anywhere. But there was something that was missing when I came back to the States. And then I dropped out of university and moved back to Israel and ended up getting a job working in a bakery, not because I wanted to be a chef or a baker or a restaurateur, but because 3 semesters of like studio art and almost no Hebrew doesn't get you very far in the Israeli job market. So I got a job working in a bakery, and I really fell in love with the culture and with working hard and being introduced to a cuisine or many different cuisines or gastronomies and culture through the eyes or the lens of like an immigrant employee was really sort of groundbreaking. And I decided then to go work. After working in a bakery for a while, I got a job working as a short order cook in a cafe, and then went to culinary school in the States, not to CIA. I'd spent all my parents' hard-earned money on like smoking pot and snowboarding at University of Vermont with like almost nothing to show for it. So I went to a culinary school in Florida, and then I moved eventually to Philly because it was like on the way to New York, And I was cooking Italian and very refined French. And then a couple things, most notably my little brother David was actually killed in service in the IDF. And I think from then on, even though it wasn't super tangible at the time, I was kind of drawn back to Israel. And over the next couple of years, you could see that I wasn't so interested in going to Europe and working in a Michelin-starred restaurant or, brunoise shallots necessarily. Like my passion and my interest was probably to get a little bit closer to my brother and to my family and to where I was from. And I got a job. My current business partner and best friend, Steve, hired me without really knowing me to be the chef of his restaurant, Marigold Kitchen. And it was new American, but I was putting Yemenite spice with braised monk fishtails and taking my grandmother's borekas and stuffing them with porcini and foie gras and things like that. And so the Israeli cuisines sort of, reapplied themselves. And people were recognizing that that's where these flavors were coming from. And eventually we decided just to open an Israeli restaurant. I think that, you're talking about 100 different sort of cuisines and gastronomies that make up Israeli cuisine. And you've got so much history, so much conflict, so much commonality. And the food is just delicious, right? So I think that it's crazy to me that it took so long for people to really get it. The way that we're introduced things here in the West are usually by immigrants, and usually that first wave, they're not doing it. They're not like opening Israeli restaurants because they care about food. They're like business people, or they've got a couple recipes and they want to Americanize things, and that's where the problem I think lies. The first like Italian food in the U.S. took a little bit of time for people to understand that it wasn't just like breadsticks and overcooked spaghetti, and that there are like many different facets that identify and characterize parts of Italian cuisine, and we're interested now in authenticity. And I think that that was kind of a benefit for us, that it took a while to be confident enough to say we're just going to make Israeli food. And when you go to Israel and you ask somebody on the street where the best Israeli restaurant is, there's no real answer to that. You've got Libyan, Bulgarian, Palestinian, Moroccan, Eastern European, all these things. But only up until recently did people start accepting or recognizing that there was Israeli cuisine, and it was the culmination of all these things. And it wasn't just Yemenite food from Yemen. It was brought by Jews. So in most cases, with the exception of the Druze or the Palestinian or the Bedouin cuisines that are lumped in Israel to like Arab, but all the food that was brought to Israel was brought by Jews. So you've got not only the laws of kashrut, like the no milk and meat and no shellfish and pork, but everybody has to participate in the Sabbath, which means everybody, all the Jewish cuisines at least, have got that sort of law, which is like Friday at sundown, you cannot touch the oven. So everyone has their like cassoulet. Everybody has got their slow roasted, whether it's cassoulet, chamin, chont, right? Like everybody's got their version of that overnight stew, and bread or laminated dough, which helps identify the fact that it was like specific to Israel, because those dishes and those cuisines don't really exist in that native country anymore. There's really no more Jews in Yemen, right? There's very few Jews in Morocco. They've all either gone to Paris, or they've gone to France, or they've come to Israel. So in a lot of cases, Israel is the only place you'll find those nuanced cuisines. And then they meet with Palestinian or Bedouin or Druze cuisine, which is scattered and also different depending on the topography. And then it also happens to be in this tiny little slice of earth, which is flanked in between the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, Sea of Galilee. You've got the north, you've got snow and wine country in the north, and then you've got the dry, arid desert, also wine country, harvested by the Nabateans, who controlled the spice trade. So you have the spice and the Silk Road. You've got the birthplace of modern and ancient agriculture and winemaking, right? And then you have 100 different cuisines toppled on each other, that a lot of which have just recently sort of moved there, within the last 200 years. So I don't know, why not cook this food? Why not eat this food? It's like unbelievably exciting. It tells the story of not just Jews, of like so many different kinds of people that have been there. It is conflict, it is commonality, it is like the Shabbat table, it is like deep, deep, deep history. And I think that especially now for the Western palate, for Americans and for Europeans, we are conscious of the fact that we come from somewhere else. We're conscious of the fact that like maybe the most exciting way to eat now isn't going to like a fancy French restaurant and buying a $600 bottle of wine. Maybe it's like telling the story of where you're from, And I think that we're constantly, the more we become American or become Israeli, we're looking at like where our family came from, and to be able to connect to all this history and tradition, and to identify ourselves and to say this is like who we are. And food is like one of the easiest ways to do that. So that lives and breathes in Israel, and that lives and breathes with just the idea of Israeli cuisine. And now, especially since traditional forms of diplomacy are so ineffective, food. And I hate to be the American or the American Israeli to say like food is this, breaking bread is somehow going to solve problems. At the end of the day, the other things that we've been relying on don't work, and the easiest, and everybody loves food. And you've got all these like, you've got these funny sort of like cliched hyperbole-esque things happening with food, especially when it comes to Middle Eastern food that somehow get a pass, you know? And I feel like that's maybe the next step for Israeli cuisine. Well, I think that the beautiful thing about our staff trip, I mean, a lot of the people had been invested in Israeli cuisine and Israeli culture without ever being there. So it was kind of this like recognition, and like there were all those aha moments where like my chef de cuisine, who's worked for me for 5 years, was like, "What's that?" And I'm like, "That's schug." And he was like, "Oh my God, I've been making that for like a quarter of my life, you know?" And so I think that when we were looking at what Israeli food was and why, if it would work here at all, it had so many things going for it. The idea of small plates and small portions and mezze, and there are a couple things about Israeli food that are now like very big trends, but in Israel were not catchphrases, they weren't hashtags, they weren't marketing material. I mean, vegetables are, plant forward cooking has been in Israel forever, and locality, right? And I mean, Israel is a tiny country, but in terms of trade, it's, especially with its neighbors there, it's essentially an island. So everything comes from there. The cucumbers and the tomatoes that you get in the market haven't been sitting on the back of a truck for like a week. There's no GMOs, and there's so many different growing cycles that, you know, if you eat a cucumber that's like 3 days old that's never been in the fridge, it just tastes better, right? And so I think that because of that, and because the reliance so heavily on fruits and vegetables, you've got this sort of perfect storm when it comes to the way that we all like to eat now, too. And it makes sense for what it is that we do, and not having to rely so heavily on proteins and giant portions of like fish and meat ensures a better quality of product, right? And when we opened this restaurant and we were out there trying to raise money, which is basically like begging your friends and family and former coworkers, you know, everyone said, "Well, is that like too political?" And it's funny because there's so many similarities with American cuisine. You know, like the idea that you could have Tex-Mex and tacos and tortillas and like Southern barbecue without delving into some very heavy issues, I think is hilarious and ironic and oftentimes uncomfortable, but the way that food can sort of explain things, I think, is really helpful. The idea that you can take all these different spices and all these different foodways and put them together, and you have words like Mediterranean, Middle Eastern, Jewish, Arabic, Palestinian, and put them in this mixing bowl and shake them up, and out comes color and flavor and, you know, the lamb fat dripping over the charcoal with like the tahina and the za'atar. Like that is what is exciting. It's the heavily seasoned vegetables with like salt and lemon and like good quality olive oil and fresh bread, and this sort of family table where people roll up their sleeves. Like the style of eating is what's so fun. When I thought that in order to be a great chef, you had to make really tight, beautiful food that we saw in all of our culinary textbooks or all the art culinaires, right? And it would change, right? I remember like French Laundry came out, and everybody at every station, in every fine dining kitchen, everyone had 10 pounds of Bermonte, right? And everybody, you know, it was like squeeze bottle of like balsamic reduction or like red pepper confetti or whatever. But if you had lobster on the menu, you were butter poaching it, you know? And then Michel Braque made its way to the States, and everybody was spoon dragging, and people really understood locality and being proud of the region that you're from. Because the way that, you know, the Aubrac region in France wasn't, there was no notoriety except for like Laol knives, but the fact that he would forage and really celebrate and showcase these dishes that were maybe lowbrow prior. You realize that if you wanted to be famous or wanted to like stand for cuisine, you needed to like plate things really nicely. You needed like a circulator, and you needed like chemicals, you know? So while we're wrapping things with chicken skin and sous vide and clarifying using gelatin and buying the most expensive French knives, you know, I would get off the airplane and go to Israel and sit down at like just a random meat, like a shipoudia, which means like kebab house or skewer house. And the bread that would come out was fresh, baked a la minute from Iraq, right? The hummus, huge debate about where hummus comes from, but like very ancient, taught to Israelis by Palestinians, dates back hundreds of years. The falafels, 4th century Coptic Christians, the bab ganoush, Levantine, Arabic, Syrian, but appropriated by the Ottomans and spread all throughout the Middle East. The pickle is seasoned with Yemenite flavor. The peppers were Balkan or Bulgarian. Another eggplant dish that's Greek, Romanian chopped liver, so on and so forth, right? 20 different colorful, bright, very vegetable-forward plates, all describing 20 different cuisines and cultures. And that was like without anybody even taking your order. That's by sitting down in a restaurant. So while we're clarifying and while we're slicing and with all these little rules that we like have learned through culinary school, no offense, by all these old male French chefs that are all dead, right? You got the entire rest of the world, which is grandmothers and grandparents and spice traders and, people that have been cooking the same thing for 4 generations without trying to win awards, teaching me what the meaning of real cuisine is. And so that was it. There was like the aha moment that I hope everybody that watches this realizes, is that it's like we have all these rules and we have all these ideas, and then you sit down at a random restaurant and it's like effortless, this cuisine that is thrusted. It's so emotional, it's so visceral, and it connects thousands of years of history, hundreds of different cuisines and cultures, and it's like compressed into this tiny little country the size of New Jersey, stuck somewhere in the Middle East.